Okay, thank you. If you could maybe take a seat, I think we're going to get started. Thank you all for being here tonight. It is so exciting to see so many familiar and also new faces in this room. My name is Azmat Khan, and I'm a professor here at Columbia Journalism School and also the director of the Lee Center for Global Journalism, which along with the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma have come together tonight to put on an event ahead of International Press Freedom Day, which falls on Wednesday, but also ahead of the one-year anniversary of the killing of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. Nearly 1 year ago, Abu Akleh was reporting from the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank when she was shot and killed. In both her life and death, Shireen Abu Akleh has had a profound impact, not just at Columbia Journalism School, but throughout our industry and across the world. Last year's class of 2022 graduates walked to get their diplomas just days after she was killed, and many of them did that wearing caps adorned with her name. Graduates of the school have investigated her death, tracing the bullet that killed her back to the position of an Israeli military convoy, and putting questions to U.S. officials about her death. Last fall, Abu Akleh was honored with the IPI World Press Freedom Hero Award here at Columbia for displaying tremendous courage and resilience in fighting for media freedom and the free flow of news. Her legacy is vast, from the countless women and girls across the Middle East whom she inspired over many years, to her relentless body of work bearing witness and telling the stories of those who go unheard. But Abu Akleh's killing has also raised serious questions about threats to press freedom, and in particular, how the U.S. government protects American journalists and seeks accountability when they're killed. Tonight's event is an effort to honor Shireen's legacy and also explore what press freedom truly means. We'll begin by screening the Fault Lines film, The Killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, followed by a discussion with three journalists who made it: Laila Al-Arian, who's a graduate of the school, Sharif Abdel Kouddous, and Kavitha Chekuru. We'll begin the film now, followed by a conversation. Thanks so much. Let me just say, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Let me just say thank you so much for making such a powerful film. I want to introduce each of you. We're going to have a conversation, and then we'll have time for questions, but we're joined tonight by three people who made this film. The first, sitting next to me, is Laila Al-Arian, whom I'd mentioned is a graduate of the school. She's an Emmy and Peabody Award-winning journalist, filmmaker, and the executive producer of Al Jazeera English's flagship investigative documentary program, Fault Lines, where her films from Haiti, Bangladesh, and across the Middle East have garnered widespread acclaim. Laila is also the co-author of Collateral Damage, America's War Against Iraqi Civilians. Next to her is Kavitha Chekuru, a senior producer at Fault Lines, where she's done investigations related to civilian casualties from U.S. operations in Afghanistan, silenced journalists under threat in Mexico, as well as this film, which was actually her first time reporting from Israel and Palestine. Next to her is Sharif Abdel Kouddous, an independent journalist and the correspondent you just saw in the film. He's reported from Baghdad during the Iraq War, New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Haiti after the earthquake, and from Egypt during the revolution, as well as Syria, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, and Algeria. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Laila, I'd actually like to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about, we've heard so much about, you can tell from the funeral scenes that Shireen Abu Akleh meant so much to people in these areas where she was reporting. What did she mean to Palestinians?
Thank you so much, Azmat, for putting this event together, for inviting us, and for holding this screening. And thank you all for coming. You may know Wednesday, as Azmat mentioned in the introduction, is actually World Press Freedom Day. And next week, May 11th, will mark 1 year since Shireen was brutally killed. and no one has been held accountable for her killing. So I think it's incredibly important to have screenings and gatherings and discussions just like this, to continue saying her name and to continue speaking about her case until there's justice and accountability. So to answer your question, Azmat, Shireen truly was an icon, both for the Palestinian people and for people across the Arab world who actually watched Al Jazeera Arabic. She had been working for Al Jazeera since 1997, so really the bulk of her career. I think she was 25 years old when she started at Al Jazeera. She was a young journalist, and she not only covered the big stories, the wars on Palestinians, but also the daily indignities of the occupation. No story was too small for Shireen, and actually as we were making this film and going through the vast archive of her career, which I can't even tell you how many hours and hours and hours of footage that was, given her rich body of work, we could see that really no story was too small, that she was so devoted to her work. People talk about, her loved ones, her friends, her colleagues, how, and I think a lot of, if there's journalists in the room, you can relate to this. She never turned her phone off. She never turned her ringer off. She was really devoted to her job as a journalist. It really, truly was a calling and a mission for her. And, I think her colleague Mujahid Sadi says it so well, that they, attacked, Shireen's killing was an attack on Palestinian journalists in the form of this big person. And this is why you saw, people in their 60s breaking down and crying, people who are used to seeing Palestinians being killed. Something was broken in them, especially with this killing, just because of who she was. And I think a testament to that is the fact that her funeral was so massive. So many people came to show their respect. And Jerusalem, for that one day, or for those hours, was truly united in grief and mourning for her.
I especially saw in the aftermath of her death, I was hearing from friends who grew up in different parts of the Arab world and just telling stories about the first time that they saw Shireen on their TV screens and what it meant to them as young girls. I have a friend from Mosul who she framed it as, where do girls in closed societies get their inspiration from? When TV, cinema, literature, and culture is so state-controlled and so closed. And she said that from a very early age, her and her friends in Mosul would watch Shireen, and she was such an example. What are some of the ways in which you've seen her be a role model or a mentor to young women journalists?
She was a mentor to so many journalists, and from everything I've heard from her dear friends, from her colleagues, she had no ego. She would be stopped in the street and people would ask her for photos and she would just be surprised, like not recognizing her own greatness. But on a personal level, none of us actually, unfortunately, ever had the chance to meet Shireen. But my younger sister, who's also a journalist, she's reported for Vice News and for other outlets from all over the world. Actually, one of her first jobs in journalism was as an intern at Al Jazeera Arabic. And she had a stint at the United Nations, and Shireen happened to be, on secondment at the UN reporting. And after the end of their week together of reporting, Shireen gave my sister a small gift of like jewelry with an embroidered design on it. At that point, my sister was very young. She'd never visited Palestine, and she told her, this is just a gift for me from Palestine, and I hope you one day visit and see sort of the land of your grandparents. So it was just such a special, and I'm sure she did this with so many people, but especially to young women, she was such an inspiration.
Thank you, that's beautiful. Kavitha, this was your first time traveling to the region. What were some of your first impressions, particularly in the parts of occupied East Jerusalem and Jenin, and where you were visiting, doing a lot of these interviews and this producing?
Yeah, I mean, I should know how to use a mic by now. I think the main thing is, I obviously knew about the occupation, work at Al Jazeera, it's kind of something we report on. But I mean, Sharif can attest to this. I feel like the whole time there, it was just every time seeing, it's just kind of the blatant way, kind of like what Laila mentioned, the way that these daily indignities of the occupation kind of play out. Just like, for instance, like at Al-Aqsa, there's that one of the last stand-ups that Shireen does. She's there and she's talking about how Muslims aren't being allowed into Al-Aqsa to pray, and even just that small thing, right, where it's not violent. Obviously there is violence there in those cases sometimes, but just that act of that limit on people, on civilians. I think just watching all of those small things, the way they add up, that I think is what stood out to me the most, and kind of reiterated that I think journalists need to do a better job covering the conflict, you know, and how very blatant a lot of the, you know, the story is, right? Like, it's not clashes, it's attacks, right? Things like that. So I think that was kind of what stood out, was how stark the occupation was.
Yeah, not necessarily the things that attract the most attention in the West when there's outright violence, but these things that slowly grind away at people. Thank you. Sharif, you've actually been covering the region and in Palestine on and off for quite a while, including reporting in Gaza, which is really incredibly difficult to access and to report from. What do you think has changed since the first time you started covering it?
The first time I went to Gaza was the first time I went to Palestine was 2011. And I think every time you go back, you see the architecture of occupation spread further. You see different enclosures, settlement building. For example, Qalandia is the main checkpoint between the West Bank and Jerusalem. It used to be just kind of a roadblock, and now it's this sprawling border, like a border complex of architecture. Gaza, every time you go, different neighborhoods have been razed to the ground. The place that I used to report from was the AP building. It's also the Al Jazeera building, was demolished. I used to stand on that roof and it was targeted and demolished. And I think, yeah, it's something that every time you go, there's kind of these new security checkpoints, new surveillance cameras, new ways of controlling and surveilling Palestinian life. But you also see new ways of resistance that Palestinians do to confront this. You see different types of militancy as well that are happening now. But yeah, it's part of like a larger settler colonial project, a creeping annexation, and it's very, very obvious when you go over, for me, just a little over a decade. You see it manifest on the ground very viscerally.
What are some of those ways in which the militancy has changed as a result of that growing reach?
Well, I think what's quite interesting now is that in Jenin is the kind of the militant stronghold of the north of the West Bank and Nablus. Jenin suffered a terrible massacre during the Second Intifada, really brutal. But we're seeing a generation now of people who are in their late teens, early 20s, who were born during the Second Intifada. And they've seen quite little from Palestinian leadership, whether it be Fatah or Hamas or PFLP or Jihad. And there's new groups in Nablus. There's one called the Den of Lions, and in Jenin there's one called the Jenin Brigade, which take funding and arms from the political leadership, but then do not take orders. They're kind of independent and do their own kind of resistance and they make their own decisions. And we saw in some of the footage in Jenin during the funeral how many shabab are armed there. But I think, and they're extremely popular with the Palestinian population, because when the Israelis come and raid, they fight back. They often lose. But I think there's these ruptures that are happening within kind of how Palestinians are resisting for armed resistance that are interesting to look at.
Obviously, operating in these areas can be incredibly difficult. What were some of the challenges of making this film? Maybe I can start with you, Kavitha, and then we can ask the others as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were logistical challenges, things like that. I think the main challenge, and we didn't overcome it, was that we didn't get to talk to anyone from the Israeli side. Obviously, and we kind of knew going in that that was going to be a tall ask, because like with anything in journalism, if you're trying to question people in power, why are they going to talk to you if it's not in their interest? And talking to us isn't in their interest. So that was frustrating because, you know, obviously that was something that we really wanted to do. We had a little bit more success, I think, on the U.S. side, but
With the Israelis, were they giving you a response like we won't sit down with you, or were you just outright being ignored?
No, they replied. They said no to an on-camera interview, and then we sent them a very detailed list of questions. I think it was like 20 questions, and they did not reply to those questions. So we just got the kind of blanket statement and summary of the investigation, which we already obviously had. So yeah, not very useful. So I think that, to me, that was probably the biggest challenge.
What about you, Sharif? What were some of the biggest obstacles in making this film?
I think on the ground there, I mean, for example, you know, accessing Jenin, you need to coordinate with someone from there. You're coming with a car from Jerusalem. You have to let them know that you're coming in. When we were flying a drone to film, there's a WhatsApp group of the Shabab. You tell them we're going to fly the drone out to film, don't shoot it down. But because this is a place that is constantly invaded, attacked, and so they have to protect their space. And when we were there was an Israeli raid. I mean, we were right on the outskirts, but we came in right after, and they had killed 2 people. So, you know, we're facing minuscule, or like we're seeing a very small sliver of what journalists like Shireen and the other journalists, Mujahid and Ali and Shada, face on a daily basis. Because when you're working as a journalist there, you're working in a context of occupation, a context of settler colonialism, which requires a significant amount of violence in order to be maintained. And so, you know, those are some of the things like we saw just a small part of. But I think it's also difficult. It was difficult for me, and I know for Kavya as well, that when you're speaking with Shireen's colleagues, to have them relive this moment. I think almost all of them cried during the interviews. I cried, and it's hard to, it's invasive in a way, but I think very important as well.
Yeah, Laila.
I was just going to say, in terms of like actually distributing the film, shortly after it was posted online, YouTube actually age restricted it, which immediately brings down the number of views and makes it very difficult. It means it's no longer a suggested video by YouTube. It means it's going to be a lot more difficult to access the film. And the reason YouTube gave was because of the shots of Shireen after she was killed, being dragged to the vehicle. And we had to make an editorial call to not blur those images because of the way that Israel tried to control the narrative from the very beginning, to muddy the waters, to suggest that it was actually a Palestinian who shot and killed Shireen. And it was very important that the audience sees that she was wearing the press vest, that it was blue, that it said the word press on it, that, you know, we needed that to be there for the record, and we weren't going to blur it, we weren't going to censor it, and we just hope that people continue watching it and sharing it. But in terms of actually getting the film out there, that was sort of an unexpected challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage you, when you get back on a laptop, to type in go onto YouTube, type in the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, and just notice that nothing pops up as you there's no suggested words. It doesn't fill it in for you. It's pretty stunning, and it is a result of what you're talking about. It is, in so many ways, incredibly inaccessible. It is age restricted. It is, you know, harder you have to sign in so often. It is incredibly challenging to think through, and I had not considered, you know, the fact that it was the nature of those images and your desire to want to show that for the purposes of this accountability, which is incredibly important. And speaking of that accountability, I want to focus a little bit about, you know, your framing of this, which is that Shireen is an American. She's an American citizen. She's also a journalist. And the United States government, they have opportunities to investigate what happened. And as you sort of chase down answers on this, you know, you got the responses that we saw from the State Department spokesperson that you spoke to. But you also mentioned there is this potential FBI investigation. What did you learn about how this investigation is being done and where the shortcomings lie?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we decided to do the story and make the film, the first thing we knew was like, all right, well, how do we push this forward? Because there had already been really amazing investigations by the Times, the Post, CNN, AP, and those were on, you know, the events of the killing, the events of that day, kind of a timeline. It was really important that those already existed, and so we said, well, what can we do to go forward? And it was about looking at the U.S. response, and the U.S. response is, you know, hinges on the Israeli response, and obviously, you know, the kind of their investigation wasn't, you know, it's not a holistic investigation if you're not speaking to witnesses. You know, I know obviously like Azmat, you've done so much reporting on U.S. military investigations, and kind of they've done, you know, similar things where they don't talk to civilian witnesses of civilian killings. And so with the U.S. kind of role there, they relied so heavily on that Israeli investigation, despite the kind of very blatant facts, right? And it's really troubling when you think about it. You know, you mentioned she's a journalist, she's an American citizen, all the things that exist, kind of the eyewitnesses, but also the video footage. The video footage is so important that, you know, in a lot of cases, and so you have the video footage, you have the eyewitnesses, you have the fact that she's an American citizen and a very prominent journalist, and you know, it didn't make it in this, but Hagai from B'Tselem said it really well. He's like, if you have all of those things added up and there still can't be accountability, what does that mean for other Palestinians who don't have all those things, right? And so the U.S. is wrong. It's pretty maddening because it's this thing where the facts are pretty clear, right? There was no crossfire. There's no crossfire. And they keep relying on that. And it's, you know, I'm trying to think of what to say without being like cursing. So, but you know, when it comes to the FBI portion, yeah, the FBI portion, it's, you know, that's a little bit, there's a lot of questions that surround it because the U.S. government has at no point have they put that information out there. All of that information, even the fact that there was an FBI investigation, came from Israeli officials. An Israeli official first leaked it to an Israeli channel in early November. And then kind of it was one Israeli official after another. And this is with the old government first, saying, well, we're not going to cooperate. But the U.S. government at no point has said anything. And I remember at one point I spoke to someone who used to be at DOJ, a U.S. attorney, and he said the reality is that the FBI would have opened up a file and started looking into this the first week probably. And so it's not like it just happened, you know, in November after all this pressure. They would have been building up just kind of the as much information as they could, which obviously is, you know, they have access to satellites and things like that. So, but whether or not that's actually going to come to anything, I think is a bigger question because it's a very sensitive case, and no matter how independent DOJ ostensibly is, it's not, you know, it doesn't mean that they're not going to tread carefully. So,
right, and in sort of thinking through the amount of video and the kinds of video and the renderings, like the photogrammetry, I know that many of my students are in this room. We've been looking at these kinds of, you know, forensic architecture or recreations, these animations of particular spaces and areas to test claims, right? There are two really well done visual investigations into this incident, many more than that actually, but like two very sophisticated ones that you can see. You had somebody from Al-Haq who partnered with forensic architecture, and it's my understanding that they too, you know, you had to protect their voice because of what has, if I'm understanding correctly, because of actions taken against their organization. Is that right, Laila? Or
yeah, exactly. Sharif, I don't know if you want to get into that, but yeah, Al-Haq's offices were raided by the Israeli government or the Israeli.
Yeah, they're one of 6 Palestinian human rights organizations that were designated terrorist organizations last year. Their offices raided and shuttered. So, I mean, they did this work after that, but for the researcher to come on and speak, they wanted their identity to be anonymous. And I think also what's great about that incredible work that they did, it shows, so we kind of, there's things that we know, right? So there was no crossfire. But this wasn't just an errant shot, right? This was extremely targeted. There's 3 bursts of gunfire. And what they showed in their investigation is the tight grouping of the bullets. From 200 meters away, the furthest the bullets are apart are 23 centimeters. That's something like this. That's incredibly accurate shooting from that distance to only have this much of a spread between the bullets. So clearly they were targeting these people. And we saw when that bystander, Sharif, tries to save or pull Shireen out, he gets targeted. So this was patient and methodical. The questions that I think an actual independent investigation could reveal more is Israeli soldiers wear body cameras. They released body cam footage in their like sham first video saying that a Palestinian gunman killed her. So the marksman would have had this body cam footage. So that's something, and of course, interviewing these soldiers. The question is, did this marksman take this into their own hands and just fire? Was there an order to fire on journalists? Was there an order to fire on these journalists? These are things we want to know. And of course, I think the danger also with this FBI investigation is that even if it is happening in this way, the outgoing Israeli president here, Lapid, said they're not going to cooperate. So the FBI can just say, we did our best. They're not cooperating. We're not getting any other info. That's it. But I mean, with the information that we have, it is absolutely ridiculous to say there's no evidence of intentionality. How did you come with this conclusion, right? Saying crossfire. There's no crossfire. So, but it's not surprising from the Biden administration, to be honest.
I mean, I've seen that in my own reporting, is that it often, with the U.S. military, its own interpretation of international humanitarian law is often about, it rests on intentionality and whether this was targeted. And yet here you have, potential evidence that may explicitly show that we don't have access to. And yet it seems like they're drawing on reports that don't have that information or haven't used that information. And it really does, I think this is a lesson for a lot of the journalism school students in this room as well about what you're supposed to do when you have this evidence or you're raising these questions and you're not really getting answers, sort of what the next step is. Could you walk through the process of sort of figuring out, I assume you went to the FBI as well, but the different places that you went for answers and what kind of responses you got at every turn?
I mean, it was a lack of answers, to be honest. I mean, the FBI, they don't comment on, or the DOJ, they're not going to comment. They said they don't comment on these. They're not going to comment on this. So that there's that. The State Department, we reached out to them, I think, as soon as we decided we were doing this. I think it was August, maybe. And with them, they didn't immediately say no, which was, and for them, again, it's about what's in their interest. And for them, there is a degree of interest in maybe speaking to Al Jazeera on this, just to show that they care, maybe. I don't know. But, we went to the White House and the NSC. They said no. Obviously, we went to the Israeli military. They said no. It's a lot of, doors in your face, or rather emails in your face, rejection emails in your face. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, it's a lot of no's. Yeah.
Blinken's representative said no, and that's how we ended up with Ned Price. But I think just as important as looking at sort of the FBI investigation or what the U.S. government is or isn't doing is the rhetoric of the administration. So you saw in the film, President Biden refusing to meet with the family in both where they live when he visited.
And he still hasn't?
He's never met with the family. Blinken has, but he hasn't. Why? It's the bare minimum that he could do. And then we saw just this past weekend at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the president bringing up, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was detained in Russia, as well as Austin Tice in Syria, no mention of Shireen Abu Akleh, a U.S. citizen. And what does that tell you about, it's an egregious omission. What does that tell you about sort of where the U.S. stands on this? And, how seriously can people take President Biden on press freedom when he only brings up certain cases and not others?
Well, I think also on that point about what happened at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, it's not just the administration. I mean, I think we really have to question ourselves about how the media in this country covers journalists who are targeted. So Evan Gershkovich, there's been very vocal calls on an institutional level from the media organizations for his release. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and Wall Street Journal last week all put out the same full-page ad calling for his release, saying, "We will not rest until he's safely back home." The National Press Club awarded him its highest honor for press freedom. That's all what should happen. That's good. Why is this not happening for Shireen? She was killed. This is a U.S. citizen. So we have to ask, why is this not happening? There's, I think, certain factors. One is she's Palestinian American. I think that is a factor. One is she's not reporting in English. She's reporting in Arabic. She's working for a non-US based outlet. None of that should matter, but I can't imagine it's not a factor. But I think another more insidious factor is that she was killed by a staunch ally of the US, whereas Evan is imprisoned by perhaps US's fiercest rival on the geopolitical stage right now. I can understand why the administration would then have a different stance, but US media organizations shouldn't. And this, I think, really points to how they adopt establishment orthodoxy and Washington consensus in the way they think about these issues and the public stances that they take. And it's very problematic.
I kept comparing, actually, I was, as all of this happened and I was watching the efforts to ask US officials about Shireen and bringing up an investigation, I kept thinking back to Marie Colvin, who was not American, but was a journalist, a Western journalist, who was killed in Syria under fire from the Syrian government. And it was something that I was surrounded by in every press organization I'm a part of. And you saw a lot of effort to try to raise this with the Syrian government. And yes, this is not, it's not a government that is an ally with most of the countries where a lot of this press activism, is happening with their own governments. And yet, you certainly saw wherever you went a kind of sense of solidarity and a kind of reckoning similar to what you're seeing with Evan now. And yet, this is someone who, it's relegated. I've observed that it is not reaching those same spaces and places. And when you ask why, the answers are incredibly unsettling. What kinds of things can journalists in this room who are thinking about how they might be able to stand up or take action or advocate for press freedom, what are things that they could be doing?
I mean, I feel like as, the more people talk about her and what happened, that's the main thing. Because it feels like, and this happens and it shouldn't happen, but it happens a lot. It feels like journalists, they move on really quickly from stories. And it's very easy for these stories then to be forgotten and the people who've been impacted to be forgotten. And I feel like journalists, particularly ones who have really big platforms, should be saying something every week, and if they have access, particularly journalists who have access to, the journalists that were at the White House Correspondents Association dinner who were chumming it up with the Biden administration. Why didn't they say anything to them as they were, drinking wine and laughing and making jokes right before Press Freedom Week? I think with journalists who have that kind of access, they should be trying to hold the administration accountable as well.
And are there questions that you think that journalists in this room should be putting to administration officials, to state government, to the FBI, to others? I know that you can't always get comment, but there are journalists in this room who I think are willing to do that kind of reporting. What would you tell them to do?
What question to ask? I don't know how I'd phrase it, but I can understand why the administration is protecting its ally, but actually, they have so much leverage with getting actual accountability, and so this impunity doesn't continue, right? It should be the opposite. So, I don't know. I mean, at this point, I would ask something that's provocative, like why hasn't there been justice for Shireen? Something like that. You don't want to get into the weeds of technicality sometimes, because the administration needs to be confronted on this in a serious way. It's not surprising. The Biden administration appears to have adopted, a policy towards Israel-Palestine of a perpetuation of the status quo, right? But the problem with that is that the status quo is dynamic, it's not static, and it's creeping annexation. And so what that means is US policies is basically support for consolidation of Israeli control of Palestinians as an underclass and support for impunity for these crimes. So I can't think of a good question, but I don't know, Laila?
Well, I think it's important to sort of look at Shireen's killing in the broader context of what's happening to Palestinians. She was one of 125 Palestinians killed last year. Many Palestinians have been killed this year. And then since the year 2000, at least 30 journalists have been killed, mostly Palestinian, but also non-Palestinians covering what's happening to Palestinians, including James Miller. And then in terms of US citizens, you have Rachel Corrie. In March, we passed 20 years since Rachel Corrie.
I think a lot of people might not know this. Do you mind giving a little bit of context and history about Rachel?
So Rachel Corrie was 23 years old, and in 2003, she was a peace activist who went to Gaza. Back then, you can get into Gaza. Now it's impossible. And she was actually, a peace activist who was going to support Palestinians. She stood in front of a Palestinian home that was about to be demolished by an Israeli soldier driving a Caterpillar bulldozer. And, this was something that peace activists at the time were doing, which is trying to protect, Palestinian homes from being demolished. And the soldier driving the bulldozer actually crushed her to death. There was a very, her family, spent 2 decades calling for justice in her case, calling for accountability. They actually sued the Israeli military, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and there were no charges ever filed. They basically said that the soldier didn't see her, and despite what eyewitnesses said. Rachel Corrie's family talks about their fight being very lonely and very frustrating, and the fact that the walls that they continue to hit in Washington, pursuing justice and accountability in her case, were at times as traumatic as losing their daughter and their sister. So I think it's really important for us, for everybody in this room, to commit to continuing to say Shireen's name. Shireen's family shouldn't feel alone. And we as journalists, this shouldn't be a controversial position to take, which is that a journalist should not be killed while doing their job. And as Sharif mentioned, Shireen was totally identifiable, wearing her press jacket, wearing her helmet, and those shots fired by a sniper were extremely precise. It belies sort of logic to say that this wasn't an intentional shot. So it's important that we continue standing up for the rights of all journalists to do their jobs safely, including Palestinian journalists.
Thank you. That was... So I want to open this up to questions. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, there is a mic in the center of the room. And so I see some people starting to line up, I think. Yes, please. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Hi, on? Yeah. Hi, thank you very much. Eileen Clancy, just Sharif, long time. So I used to do video documentation for human rights, before cell phone video, really old. And so mostly policing of protests in the US, and then about 10 years a project in Northern Ireland. So it was a smaller scale, but also a militarized environment, and very heavy surveillance environment and all that. So So I followed this very closely as the forensic video, analysis was done and all that, and it seemed very clear to me that with the materials that were available, that as the State Department spokesperson said, were in the public domain, not the enormous amount of evidence that they would have access to that we don't see, right? But just the public stuff. It seemed very clear that it was a targeted shot, and it was a sniper, and that's what they could see, and that's what they do, and there have been patterns of this before. So to me, yes, that's very important. And everyone, the news media and everyone went and did these analyses, but then it's sort of over. And I think we see that the news organizations, when they don't have an official news peg, they don't know where to go. There's almost like, it's just kind of your political thing. But so what are the opportunities to kind of discuss the issues and what you said about the YouTube video being restricted? Now, trying to control the administration here, no. Israel is going through what it's going through. Okay, really no movement on that front, but at least the story can get out. So if there's actually even a block on the story, that's a big deal. And as human rights groups have used YouTube over the years, there are already organizations like in the US and other places that challenge these kinds of restrictions. So I think there's two things that I would encourage people to kind of pursue and actually call YouTube or write to them or whatever and be very aggressive about it. Challenge the restriction, perhaps put a different video that isn't restricted and then give a link to something else, like figure out a way, or make that a story and then make it a story elsewhere. So these are just some thoughts, but also it should not be search restricted. So the algorithmic search, that's a totally separate issue. Because you can find all kinds of horrors on YouTube, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that you can't find this is kind of crazy.
That's a great story idea for many people in the room.
So,
did you have did you want to ask them a question?
Well,
succinctly?
I guess, no, I'm not really sure. I guess not. So I'll just leave it there.
That was really, I think that was very helpful for a lot of people in this room.
Yeah,
So
if you had a different sense of it, and I'm asking Sharif because I know he's like from TV land especially, so I know you know a little bit more about that.
Yes, no, please,
Anyway.
go for it.
On the YouTube restrictions, you might find this interesting, especially for the journalists in the room and even the non-journalists. So we released an episode about the imprisonment of Julian Assange a couple of months ago. And in that film, we actually show the collateral murder video. I don't know if maybe there's people in the room too young to remember, but back in 2010, WikiLeaks released a video that was released by Chelsea Manning, who was an army specialist who released, tens of thousands of documents, hundreds of thousands related to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This footage showed a U.S. airstrike on Iraqi civilians, and we speak to a brother, many years later. His brother was killed in 2007.
A journalist.
A journalist, a Reuters journalist, photojournalist, and a driver for Reuters were both killed in that attack. And, all these years later, the brother talks about the fact that Julian Assange is being, prosecuted in part for releasing this material. And so YouTube restricted that episode as well because of that collateral murder footage. So we said, okay, we're going to blur. We're going to put a huge box on the footage. If people want to watch it, they can. It is on YouTube, but we're like, okay, you want to restrict our video, fine. We put a massive box, and we appealed it with YouTube, and YouTube said it's still restricted because you can hear the audio, and the audience knows that there's an attack. So that video is. So I actually think it's very possible that even if we put a huge box on Shireen, that they would still somehow justify restricting it. So this is really concerning to me. We talk about freedom of press, freedom of media. How do we even tell these stories? How do we educate a generation that has no idea what happened in the collateral murder video if it's not even accessible for people?
Thank you. Yeah, Abdullah.
Hi, I'm Abdullah Yosun. MA Politics in Columbia University. I want to ask a political question. So you went to the region a lot of times, and in Palestinian context, the two-state solution becomes a very, far remote and maybe impossible task in the foreseeable future. So what is your projection about Israel becoming what some people say an apartheid state, one state? So how would this affect the resolution of the Palestinian conflict? Thank you.
The MA in Politics program.
Sure. Well, I think what Palestinians have been saying for many years, and more recently, the two leading human rights groups in the world, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, all say that there is an apartheid system between the river and the sea, using various methods of control for Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians in Jerusalem, Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinian citizens of Israel. So I don't think there's any serious observer or any Palestinian really, or anyone really believes that the two-state solution is anything that's viable at this point. I think what we've seen with these kind of unprecedented protests in Israel is quite deeply concerning, actually, because these are Israelis that are going out, their rights are being threatened. And they have shown that when they can disrupt the government, they can boycott their government, they can come out in huge numbers and block to cause change. They've never done this for Palestinians. And so what that indicates is that there's a deep consensus within Israeli society about this system, and that they're actually protesting for apartheid maintenance of how it is now. We want to keep it as it is. So I think that's very concerning, actually. I don't think it's surprising for many Palestinians. So I don't think anyone can project what's happening, what will happen. But I think the fact that Palestine still exists, that the Palestinian peoples are still there after all of this, is encouraging, and I think we can all learn from it.
Hi, my name is Steve. I want to thank those of you who avoided using language like sides and conflict in talking about this, and I appreciate that intentionality. One thing I learned a lot from teaching in Palestine was just to take that kind of understanding when you can see settler colonialism so clearly there, back to the US or to other places where things are sometimes framed as side or a conflict that is equal when it's not. And my question is about if you could talk more about kind of I noticed there's a lot of imagery of Christians in the filming, and the rosary, looked like a lot of intention to show that, which I thought was really powerful and good, because you don't see that a lot in the coverage. And one thing a lot of people in Palestine talked about when I was there was how much the Jewish community in the US has actually done a lot of organizing. And if you look at Gallup polls and stuff, the people most critical of the Israeli state and what's happening to Palestinians are actually Jewish Americans, and the people who are less critical are the Christians in the US. And I think about moments like in the 80s and the Central American Solidarity Movement, where you had strong church movements, very popular, raising awareness because there was Catholics, Christians being killed in El Salvador and different places. And I see that within the Muslim community here. There's strong national organizations where you could be up in a little mosque as far as like Upper Westchester, and there'll be a packed auditorium with people coming all over to support Palestinians. So why isn't this happening within the Christian community in the US? Why aren't there national organizations forming? And was that part of the thinking and the way you filmed this and had some of the Christian imagery? And if you could speak more just to what we can't see in terms of that dynamic of the Christian community in Palestine.
I guess the short answer is no. Really, when we filmed that, when we were there filming, we were with Lena, her niece, and so it was really us just kind of filming with her, and also just because those are the items there that people placed as remembrance, right? And so, in that sense, that was the intentionality with that. It wasn't to like emphasize that Shireen was a Christian, because to be honest, I don't think it should matter. She's Palestinian, so, and that's it. That's why she was killed, and and so we didn't go into it saying, let's make sure that we emphasize that part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was her faith seemed to be an important part of her identity, and so showing that as well was to show a little bit of who she was.
To answer your question, I mean, there's also this long sort of history of evangelicals supporting Israel based on their religious beliefs that Israel needs to be in control of, Jewish people in order for Christ to come back, and that sort of like theological belief on sort of the extreme evangelical side has also sort of marked, at least in large evangelical communities, their support for Israel. And sometimes support for Israel is higher within those communities and even parts of the Jewish community. So there's that dynamic also happening. But, I think there is a lot of ignorance about the just existence of Palestinian Christians in general. And I think a lot of people were surprised who may not even know that Palestinian Christians exist to see that Shireen was Christian, and, that her funeral was in a church and all of that. So it's just an important part of her story and her identity.
Hi, my name is Joe Galvin. I'm a journalist. I did some of the open source work on Shireen's death, actually, in the early stages. Yeah, I mean, first of all, thanks very much for being here and keeping this issue alive. I think one of the most frustrating things, as someone who did a little bit of work on the story, is it's kind of slipped away from the consciousness a little bit. And you mentioned about the Wall Street Journal reporter, but also the establishment is, I suppose, orthodox, are highlighting his case, but the anti-establishment always highlight Assange, and no one is really still speaking about Shireen. And as we approach the first year, I think that's awful, because this really is as close to an open and shut case as you can get. In the first 24 hours after her killing, I was looking at the open source evidence, and even at that very early stage, the evidence was quite clear. And then I think I had one open question about one particular video, and that question was answered with the release of more Al Jazeera footage, I think in the next 24 hours. So within 48 hours, we essentially knew what had taken place. Every other investigation has stood that up. So yeah, the frustration is lack of accountability, and that we need to be talking about this a lot more. But I have a more specific question, which is related to the ICC. In December, there was evidence submitted to the ICC as a move to try and get the ICC to pursue this case. And do we know where that is at the moment? Have we heard any updates, or have the family heard anything in that regard? Thanks.
Thank you so much for your work. We're really grateful. Something I think about a lot is the fact that Shireen's death is probably the most investigated death of any Palestinian in history. Between the work you did, CNN, AP, Kavitha mentioned all the different organizations, the UN. What does that say, that there's no accountability given all this investigative work? It's really something. As far as the ICC, my understanding, and I don't know if you all heard anything else, is that the US and Israel have both opposed the ICC application to the ICC, and that there hasn't been any movement on it. But I don't think there's been any update in that regard, unfortunately.
Hi, I'm Mesa. Thank you guys so much for coming. This is kind of a full circle for me. I graduated last year. I think I was the only Palestinian that I knew of in the journalism school here, in the MS program. And I organized a vigil. Melanie was there. It was only a handful of people in the rain. And the last 10 days before I graduated were really painful because not one professor acknowledged it. Dean Cole sent an email, and it was during a time that we were getting a lot of emails about Ukraine, and we were getting emails even about injuries, knee injuries, and we were really, really updated, which I appreciated because it made me feel protected as a journalist. But of course, when it came to Shireen, it was nothing. Oh my gosh, I do not want to cry. So anyways, I really do, Osman, thank you. I wasn't lucky enough to take your class, but this means a lot to have, this on campus. And to you guys, of course, I look up to journalists like you. My question is, you know, Sharif, you acknowledged that you got a glimpse of what Palestinian journalists on the ground experience. But I think also we know that Palestinians in the diaspora feel the reverberations of the occupation even here in terms of how we report. And since 2021 and the protests, I've had some hope, and it kind of was the reason why I came to Colombia, because growing up as a Palestinian, you don't see the coverage that you want to see, and there's not really, you kind of think there's not a point to do it, because that is what I want to talk about. But 2021 really changed things for me, and then since then we've been seeing polls that, you know, the American population's even starting to look at the conflict differently. Do you see this being reflected in the media industry as well? You know, do you have any advice, for not only for Palestinians, but for people who want to cover Palestine? And, you know, how do we play that game? It's a game, an agenda game, and how do we wait until we're experienced and have our name, or do we just kind of go for it as, you know, early journalists? Yeah, how do we navigate the newsrooms?
How to navigate the newsrooms. I mean, for me, when I first started covering Palestine, was Gaza, and was just to go, and once you're there, kind of, I found outlets that were willing to cover, but that allowed me to use the voice that I want to use and the way I want to write, which I think is accurate. But I think, yeah, you know, people don't know, when we were discussing 2021, this was May of almost exactly 2 years ago. What was dubbed kind of the Unity Uprising, which was many cumulative reasons of why it was ignited, but on the first day of Ramadan, Israeli soldiers closed down Damascus Gate, which is like the beating heart of life in Jerusalem, Palestinian life. And so Palestinian youth kind of resisted that, fought back with their bodies and rocks and kind of opened the space up. Then they resisted attacks on Al-Aqsa. And then this kind of like went and fused with the struggle in Sheikh Jarrah, this neighborhood where Palestinian families are resisting displacement. And it became this focal point. And then Gaza kind of came in solidarity and fired rockets, and then was subject to very fierce Israeli bombardment. And very, very significantly, Palestinian citizens of Israel in so-called mixed cities like Haifa and Lid rose up also. And I think this is why we saw such a vicious backlash. This is the reason that so many Palestinians have been killed over the past year and this year as well. It's a response to this, because I think very threatening to them. But you know, when you're talking about kind of the coverage of that moment, I think what was very important, and this is something Edward Said used to say, we need people representing us speaking in English on networks, right? You know, in Edward Said's day, there was him and like a few others really Palestinian speaking. This time we had these voices. We had like people like Mohammed al-Kurd speaking on CNN and all these places very eloquently, challenging, and others as well. And I think this did change the way these things were covered. I think having Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch say this is apartheid allows journalists, I heard the word apartheid on CNN, you know? So there definitely is a shift, I think, in the way it's being covered in newsrooms here, but it's still a huge challenge.
I think it's important for journalists to sort of take a page out of the way that journalism has addressed sort of police shootings of unarmed black people, and sort of revise their guidelines and their best practices in terms of like just giving deference to police and to authorities, and sort of, rather than serving as stenographers for the police and for authorities, actually, like in the way that Azmat went and investigated civilian casualties, like actually doing your job. That's all we ask, is like, when it comes to this issue, it seems like the rules of journalism just fly out the window. Passive voice is king, right? Shireen dies, right? Brent Renault was killed in Ukraine, but Shireen just died at the age of 51. You know, giving deference to the Israeli narrative, no matter what, like rather than just, again, reporting a story out, talking to eyewitnesses. You see a lot of times suspicion of Palestinian eyewitnesses as if they have some kind of agenda, not that they're, you know, and contrast that with Ukraine, where Ukrainian voices are centered, where they're seen as credible, as important to understanding the story. So I think really calling out the BS, for lack of a better word, when we see it. And I think, you know, for the most part, things have changed, but for the most part, mainstream coverage of the Palestinian issue remains deeply problematic. Just I think it was a month ago, the New York Times had a story about, I believe it was about the Lion's Den in Nablus. Palestinian violence as a phrase appeared, I think, 11 times. Not a single mention of Israeli violence. So omitting basic context, basic facts, just seems to be sort of the norm. Even with the initial reporting of Shireen's death, you had the New York Times falsely attributing to Al Jazeera that it was clashes. And I think, you know, undoing these kind of poor practices is really critical to really having the public understand what's actually happening on the ground. And I think that can only happen with more Palestinian journalists in the newsroom and people who are actually willing to sort of push back against these bad practices.
Great. Thank you, Shukran Ktir, for this very powerful movie. And that made me actually wonder what avenues of resistance do the Palestinians have? When they do armed resistance, in the media it's called terrorism. When it is peaceful, as in BDS, they call it anti-Semitism. So really, like, there's no room for Palestinians actually to resist in the international narrative. And I believe that a lot of journalists, a lot of researchers, they kind of avoid working on Palestine for that exact reason. Like for me, for example, I wanted to work on Palestine. My father would tell me, like, you know, like you have to be very careful doing that. So my question, actually building up on the other question, I'm pretty sure you faced such challenges. So what's your advice, being someone who's working on Palestine, having this Palestinian narrative, to challenge the other narrative, which is obviously very powerful? Thank you.
I think in this country, yes, Palestine holds a special place where its coverage of it is much more difficult and the backlash is potentially much more severe. But I think any good journalism should be challenging forms of power and authority. So there should be a risk regardless of what you're doing. If you're investigating US military strikes or you're investigating an Israeli raid, you know, I think that I don't want to say, like, you know, tell anyone to take any risks or anything, but that shouldn't deter the work. I think the journalism that's good has to challenge those forms of power, and if it doesn't, then, you know, maybe no, it should. So yes, there's a backlash to this for sure, but I think that that probably means you're doing good work.
Hi, thank you guys for this very powerful film. One of the more striking moments in the film for me was that moment toward the end when you were interviewing the young journalist Shada, who was there with Shireen, and she speaks to kind of the distance that she's keeping from her line of work. And I'm just curious, you know, beyond, of course, there's that immediate trauma of the people who were there, who witnessed that, who were standing right next to her. But beyond the journalists that were there and were present, what were kind of like the reverberations of this on just the media landscape in Palestine with Palestinian journalists in general, and who is the next Shireen? Who can we look to be this kind of icon, as you called her? Hi.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, I think, I mean, their colleagues are still, they haven't stopped reporting, so there's that. And I think, I guess in terms of how it reverberated, I think obviously Shada spoke a bit to, you can tell from the fact of, her leaving that impact, but I think just from judging by the way that they're still going, I think it's kind of the opposite effect of maybe what the intention of the targeting was, right? That it's kind of like, okay, then we have to keep doing this, because if the if the intention wins out, then what does that mean? That kind of just, it's, and so I think I'm in awe that they're able to still do the work they do after that, especially watching not just a colleague, but watching a friend killed before your eyes. The fact that they're able to still do their job while still also being attacked. I think maybe 5 days before we spoke, we interviewed Mujahid. I think he was attacked. There was another raid in Jenin, and they had to, they were being fired upon by the Israeli military. They actually had to call the Red Crescent to get the Israeli military to stop. I think even then it still took a while. But I mean, I think the attack, obviously, like I think that's the thing, though. The journalists are still being attacked quite often, more often even. And I think that's kind of the consequence of the impunity in her case, right? That's what happens when there's impunity. It means that these things continue to happen. So
I think we have time for one more question.
So much pressure. I'm actually not a journalist. I'm an aid worker. So I've had the privilege of spending a lot of time in Gaza, in Yemen, in Iraq, and also in Ukraine. And something that, with those 4 missions in the same year, that really stood out to me was that when I would go to places like Gaza, like Yemen, etc., people would say to me, how can we get in the media? And I'm talking to people who, to frankly, speak better English than all of us in this room, that are so supremely educated, that know their country better than anyone in the world. And I mean, I don't know what to tell them. And when I spent a lot of time in Kyiv, I felt that there were Ukrainians who were in the media, and that's brilliant. That's exactly how it should be. Is there an accessibility problem here? Especially for somewhere that's so inaccessible? And I speak as an Iranian myself, that my country is very inaccessible, and yet there are so many Iranians who speak brilliant English. How can we get their voices in the media? Is it accessibility? Is it a lack of credibility from legacy institutions? What can be done?
I mean, I feel like that's a question for a lot of particularly the big legacy media organizations in the US. Not to toot Al Jazeera's own horn, but everybody in the bureau there is Palestinian. I'm very curious to the last time that any of the major US organizations who have bureaus in Jerusalem, when was the last time they had a Palestinian bureau chief? How many Palestinians do they have working in all those offices? I don't know. I think that's a question for them. So, and I think I think the answer is reflected in the way they cover Israel and Palestine.
Okay, one more.
Hi, Miles Kaggins. I'm with the New Lines Institute, and I'm a former U.S. government spokesman. I'm wondering if in your reporting you use the Freedom of Information Act to try to learn how the State Department and White House developed the messaging around Shireen's killing and your subsequent interview request.
So many good
And does
reporting
Israel have a
ideas in
similar
these
FOIA-type process?
In terms of FOIAing the State Department, we didn't in terms of their messaging. We could, but the reality is also we kind of know that we're not going to get that information anytime soon, or they'll restrict it and kind of like black out everything that would be pertinent in it. And so at the same time, to be honest, I don't even know. I kind of feel like their actions and their words speak pretty clearly about how they feel about this, and what they want to happen or don't want to happen. So we could try that, but I think that they've made it very clear about what they think of Shireen and the killing and her being killed.
It's funny because poor Miles, I actually used to flood his inbox when he was at CENTCOM and the spokesperson in Operation Inherent Resolve, and yet we've had so many really fascinating conversations, and thank you for that question. I really appreciate that you raised that, because I have some tips. I have some ideas, actually. I kind of want to submit some FOIAs now and get some lawyers to help litigate and get some docs a little bit more quickly. But I just want to say thank you to each of you. That was moving. That was brilliant. That was so powerful. You spoke to so many questions of very different people in this room. And I know we'll all walk away with many lessons. So thank you for the film, and thank you for your time tonight. I should say we have the room for like another 20 or so minutes, so if you'd like to chat, meet others, approach them, feel free.